tonight we drift toward a story most people never notice. The one where human beings decided the invisible should have names. You stand on a quiet dock somewhere between dusk and eternity, smelling salt and pitch, watching the sails of a ship tremble against the sky's last bruised light. The air itself seems alive, whispering through ropes and tar. It's just wind, you tell yourself, until the old sailors around you start talking to it. They call it by names that sound like prayers or insults, depending on the mood. You begin to realize something ancient and slightly ridiculous. They believe the wind can hear them. You probably won't survive this voyage, but hey, at least you'll die educated. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing there, boots damp, heartbeat slow, as the age of exploration unfurls like a map drawn in ink that's still wet. The ocean stretches beyond your courage, and the sailors mutter to the sky. Back then, wind wasn't air in motion. It was temper, god, monster, sometimes friend. When it turned warm and kind, they thanked it. When it howled, they begged forgiveness. They had no satellites, no barometers, just instinct and centuries of whispered superstition. The only way to live with something so moody was to name it. On an early voyage in the 15th century, a Portuguese captain wrote that the wind wears faces. He meant it literally. A northeast gust could be a sly companion. A sudden squall from the west, a devil's laugh. The naming began as survival psychology, a way to make the unpredictable seem a little more personal. After all, you can't reason with chaos, but you can try to charm it. By candlelight below deck, you might overhear sailors teaching one another the tongue of the wind. The breeze off the African coast was the lavesh. The dry gusts of the Sahara became sirocco. Even the Mediterranean's still air was branded Banacha, the good lull. Of course, historians still argue whether these names evolved from local dialects or from seafarers' superstition, but everyone agrees. The act of naming made the wind part of the crew. When morning comes, the ship creaks forward. The captain points to the horizon and says, "The north breathes cold tonight." Nobody laughs. They've seen what happens when you mock the wind. One story goes that a young sailor once boasted he could outsmart Boreas, and by dusk, the ship's mast had snapped like a breadstick. The crew buried what was left of him at sea, whispering apologies to the northern sky. Even now, centuries later, you can almost feel that same anxiety. It's the hush before a storm when the air holds its breath. Sailors called it the waiting wind, and every culture had a version of it, a pause that made your skin prickle, the world suddenly listening. One fringe belief said the sea's surface rippled with faces during that silence, tiny spirits preparing to blow. But wind naming wasn't just fear. It was art. You picture maps painted by trembling hands, covered in roses and arrows. Each line marked a voice of the world. The sailors weren't poets by choice. They were poets by necessity. How else do you remember the patterns that decide whether you live or die? Naming the wind turned survival into song. Sometimes you imagine yourself there, hauling a rope, your fingers raw, trying to guess which invisible god will strike next. You'd want something to call it too. The Levante, rising from the east. The Ponente, sinking with the sun. The Mistral, cold and clean, racing down from the mountains of France. Each word sounds like breath itself, proof that humanity can't help but turn fear into language. One sailor's diary from 1498 claims that when they reached the equator, the air went still for days. No wind. Just heat and despair. The men cursed the silence, swore they'd rather fight a storm than this dead calm. So they named it, the doldrums. A word born from boredom and madness, still used today. You might smile, realizing even your weather app still speaks their language. Historians still argue whether naming the wind ever offered real advantage or if it was pure illusion, a mental trick to survive chaos. But perhaps it doesn't matter. What matters is that they believed names could tame the unknown. You've done it too, in your own way, naming fears to make them smaller. That's all they did, out there on a wooden coffin in the middle of nowhere. As the night deepens, the sails sigh again, and you start to hear the pattern behind the noise, the same one that haunted and guided the sailors of old. The whisper of the sea teaching you its oldest truth. Every gust has a story, every breeze a name, and if you listen long enough, you might learn to tell them apart. You wake to the sound of ropes complaining against wood. The sun is barely up, a watery orange smudge over an endless gray horizon. The sea is calm for now, but the sailors are already scanning the sky like detectives reading a suspect's body language. You can tell they don't just feel the wind, they hear it. It's as if the air speaks in a code only they understand. Someone unfurls a worn scrap of parchment, and suddenly you're staring at the ancestor of every compass that ever spun, the wind rose. Before there were maps shaped like the world, there were maps shaped like breath. Early sailors drew circles divided into 12 or 16 lines, each one pointing toward a name, a sound, a story. You trace your finger along the ink: Tramontana, Greco, Levante, Sirocco, Ostro, Libeccio, Ponente, Maestro. Each word is a direction, yes, but also a personality. The sea didn't have north, east, south, and west yet. It had moods. This first compass of voices began somewhere in the Mediterranean, long before the age of exploration set its sails. Phoenicians, Greeks, and later the Romans had already turned wind into mythology. To navigate was to speak the language of invisible gods. When the north wind blew too sharply, sailors whispered the name Boreas, believing he came from Thrace, wild and jealous. The south wind, Notus, was damp and mournful, often blamed for sickness or spoiled cargo. You might roll your eyes, but then again, you've probably yelled at your Wi-Fi router when it misbehaved. Same energy. The earliest wind roses weren't drawn by scientists, they were drawn by men who feared being swallowed by the sea. They used pigmented inks mixed with egg whites and ground shells, sketching their belief systems into circles. Every line radiated outward from a single center point, like the eye of creation, or maybe the calm inside a storm. Historians still argue whether these symbols came from navigation necessity or religious ritual. Maybe both. Humans are very good at pretending logic and faith aren't sharing the same hammock. As you lean over the parchment, the ship lurches slightly. A sailor laughs, tapping a spot marked Greco. He explains, in a dialect thick with salt and wine, that this is the northeast wind, the one that smells like rain before it arrives. He says his father taught him to taste it. Open your mouth, let the air rest on your tongue, and you'll know where home is. You try it. The air tastes like copper and lemon peel. Maybe he's right. There's a rhythm to the way these men speak about direction. They don't say, we sail east. They say, we follow Levante's breath. It's subtle, but it changes everything. To name the wind is to accept you're not in charge. You're borrowing its favor, not commanding it. The medieval poet Dante even used the rows of winds to describe divine order, each breeze a spoke in heaven's wheel. Meanwhile, you're just trying to keep your lunch down. At night, when the stars blink open, the captain explains how those ancient wind roses became the foundation for navigation charts. The idea spread like gossip. Traders in Venice copied it, mariners in Lisbon improved it, and eventually, every explorer from Spain to the Indies carried one nailed to the cabin wall. Each compass was like a rosary of survival. Say the names correctly, and maybe the sea lets you live another day. Early wind roses weren't drawn north up. They rotated depending on which port the mapmaker loved most. That means if you were sailing from Sicily, your chart might put Sirocco at the top instead of Tramontana. Imagine arguing directions when everyone's map points somewhere else. Historians still debate whether this chaos caused more shipwrecks or more drinking. Probably both. And then there's the voice of the wind itself. The rigging moans, and the sails ripple like lungs. You begin to think maybe each gust does have its own tone, a high whistle for Levante, a low hum for Ponente. Some crews even tuned their ship bells differently depending on the wind's pitch, believing it pleased whichever spirit was steering the breeze. You can almost picture it, a floating orchestra of ropes, wood, and fear, performing for invisible critics. You hear laughter behind you. 2 sailors are carving something into a beam, 8 arrows in a circle, a crude wind rose. Each arrow ends with a tiny face, one smiling, one frowning, one yawning, one crying. They say it's for luck, but you realize it's something deeper. It's a confession that they are not just mapping weather, they are mapping emotion. Humans always have. The wind rose was the first time we admitted the sky affects our mood. When the storm finally comes, it's sudden. A sharp crack of thunder, a flash that turns every face ghostly white. The ship heels hard, and the captain roars something about Boreas taking offense again. You cling to the railing, drenched and half laughing because the superstition almost feels real now. The crew chants the wind names like a list of friends they hope will intervene. By dawn, the sea settles. The parchment, somehow dry, lies on the deck beside a coil of rope. The wind rose's ink glistens in the pale light. You notice the center point again, the still eye surrounded by chaos, and understand why sailors loved it. It wasn't just a tool. It was a promise, that even when the world spins, there's always a quiet point you can steer toward. You fold the map, tuck it beneath your coat, and breathe in the morning air. It tastes like salt and victory. You might not trust the wind, but at least you know its names now. And like every sailor who ever survived a voyage, you whisper a small thanks, to the gods, to the science, and maybe to yourself, for listening closely enough to hear the difference between a course and a compass. The morning arrives with a sulk. The wind is shy, hesitant, as if it knows you've started paying attention to it. The ship drifts on a lazy swell, and a sailor nearby mutters, "Zephyrus must still be sleeping." You've heard that name before, soft and musical, the kind that feels like sunlight through linen. To these sailors, Zephyrus isn't just a direction, he's a personality. You realize that somewhere between myth and weather report, humans decided to make the wind a family affair. The Greeks, of course, were the first to throw a dinner party for the elements. They called them the anemoi, the 4 great winds, each with its own domain, season, and wildly inconsistent temperament. Boreas from the north, cruel, icy, fond of freezing livestock for fun. Notus from the south, damp, moody, and given to bringing thunderstorms that ruined everyone's plans. Eurus from the east, unpredictable, the sort of wind that cancels weddings and breaks pottery. And Zephyrus, gentle Zephyrus, was the west wind, bringer of spring, bees, and what little good mood the Mediterranean ever allowed. You can almost imagine a Greek captain in the 5th century BC, standing barefoot on a deck of creaking cedar, shouting, "Boreas! Enough already," while a storm tore at his sails. It sounds theatrical, but for them, it wasn't metaphor, it was management. To name the wind was to assign it responsibility. And just like a bureaucrat, a named entity could be petitioned, bribed, or blamed. One mainstream fact historians love: the Athenians actually built a monument for these wind gods, the Tower of the Winds in Athens, still standing today. Each side of the marble octagon shows a carved figure blowing in its assigned direction, robes flaring, cheeks puffed out like divine bagpipes. Beneath each god, A weather vane once turned to show which deity currently had the floor. Think of it as the world's fanciest weather app, except the notifications arrived in thunder. Of course, sailors being sailors, mythology quickly got practical. They didn't just worship the winds, they measured them. The philosopher Aristotle, yes, the same guy who thought eels reproduced by spontaneous generation, once tried to classify the winds into a neat 12-part system. He claimed each gust had its place on a cosmic wheel. Historians still argue whether he was describing actual weather patterns or just showing off to his students. Either way, it gave future navigators a vocabulary that sounded poetic enough to keep them sane. You find yourself liking Zephyrus the most. The sailors do, too. When the ship drifts westward and the air softens, they hum an old chant supposedly offered to him: "Blow kindly, sweet one, and carry us home." There's something soothing about it, even if your modern brain knows it's just moving air molecules. The sound feels ancient, comforting, like calling a pet by name. Meanwhile, Boreas remains the troublemaker. One story you overhear, passed around the deck with the same seriousness as gossip, is that Boreas once fell in love with an Athenian princess named Oreithia. When her father refused him, he did what any self-respecting north wind would do: he kidnapped her. The resulting marriage was loud, cold, and very unpopular with sailors. Every time the northern wind ripped through their sails, they blamed the jealous husband. You can't help but grin. Even the weather had relationship drama back then. There's also a fringe tidbit that the ancient Greeks believed you could trap a wind if you caught it at the right moment. Some sailors carried small leather bags said to hold gusts given by the god Aeolus himself, the keeper of winds. If you opened the wrong bag, boom, instant tempest. Historians still debate whether these wind bags were symbolic or literal, but either way, it gave later storytellers a field day. Odysseus, famously, had one. His crew, being human, opened it too soon. Classic workplace error. As the ship drifts south, a warm breath slides across your cheek. Notice the southern wind. It carries the scent of far-off deserts and spices. The crew doesn't like this one much. They say notice brings storms that ruin fresh bread and spoil the salted fish. He's a drunkard, one man mutters. Never shows up without a hangover. You glance at the clouds and suspect he might be right. When you mention the modern idea of high and low pressure systems, the captain snorts. We already knew that, he says. We just gave them faces. He points upward where the sun fades behind gray. There, Eurus. He sulks when we ignore him. You realize how deeply these beliefs were woven into life at sea. Naming the wind wasn't ignorance, it was intimacy. To modern eyes, it looks like superstition. To them, it was respect. There's an odd comfort in this mythology, even if it's unscientific. It makes the world feel alive. You've named storms in your own way, called them by nicknames, cursed them like exes. The only difference is, the Greeks had the good manners to sculpt their bad weather into art. The wind shifts again, cooler now, sharper. You pull your coat tighter. Somewhere below deck, a sailor is carving a tiny compass on a piece of driftwood. You recognize the symbols: Boreas, Zephyrus, Notus, Eurus. He hums to himself as he works, a tune that sounds suspiciously like a lullaby. You realize it isn't just a carving, it's a prayer. By nightfall, the ship glides beneath a clean sky. The stars look almost smug. You think of all the sailors who came before, whispering the same names to the same invisible currents, trying to stay alive on the mercy of myth. Maybe that's what naming does. It doesn't give control, it gives connection. You can't master the wind. You can only know it well enough to say hello. The sails rustle softly, and for a moment you could swear you hear laughter in the breeze. Maybe Zephyrus really is awake now, brushing his fingers through the ropes, nudging you onward into deeper waters. You smile, because if the wind's going to carry you, you might as well call it by name. The air thickens with warmth and spice as you drift closer to the Indian Ocean. The deck smells of salt, cloves, and something else, anticipation. The European sailors around you have swapped their wool coats for linen shirts, sweating through every prayer they ever learned. Ahead lies a world where the wind doesn't just wander, it returns. Predictable, steady, and almost polite. You're entering the domain of the monsoon. Long before Europeans blundered into these waters, Arab and Indian sailors already knew the monsoon's moods as intimately as family. They had names for them too: Shamal for the dry northwesterlies that scour the Persian Gulf, Kaskazi for the cool wind of the East African coast, and Kharif, the season's wet breath that brings both life and disaster. You can almost feel the sea shifting beneath you as those winds trade their turn on stage, one exhaling as another inhales. A grizzled helmsman with sun-browned skin and a beard like driftwood tells you, "Here, we don't follow stars. We follow the scent of wind." He gestures to the horizon, where faint storm lines blur the sky into watercolor. You smell Kharif, you know the rains are coming. You smell Shamal, you know to head home. He says this with the calm certainty of someone who's never opened a weather app. It's easy to forget, in this humid lull, that the monsoon system shaped the entire world's trade centuries before the age of exploration. You're watching the original global shipping schedule unfold. Arab sailors timed their voyages from Oman, Gujarat, or Zanzibar to catch the Kaskazi winds out in December and the Kuzi winds home by May. Miss the shift by even a few days, and you could be stranded half a year in a foreign port, your cargo molding in the heat. Historians still argue whether this rhythm of wind effectively birthed the most reliable world economy. But when you're standing here, you can feel the logic in your bones. As you listen to the sailors mutter their wind names, you realize that these aren't just directions, they are seasons. Back home, people name months. Out here, they name winds. And the words themselves move like the air they describe: smooth, rolling, touched with music. Shamal, Kaskazi, Kuzi. You repeat them quietly, the syllables leaving your tongue like sails unfurling. In the dim light of dusk, you find yourself sitting beside a young navigator tracing circles on a palm leaf chart. The patterns are so intricate they almost hum. He tells you the chart isn't meant to be read, it's meant to be remembered. Each curve marks a shift in monsoon breath. When the lines intersect, the seasons collide. You realize that centuries before printed maps, knowledge was passed through rhythm, memory, and story. The wind, he says, is our calendar. It's not just trade and timing, though. There's myth here, too, a softer, saltier kind than the Greek tempers. One story says that the monsoon is the sigh of a sea goddess who weeps for her lost lover each year. Her tears fall as rain, then dry again when her strength returns. You think of that the next time the sky opens in a warm, endless downpour. Early European explorers arriving here thought the monsoon winds were magical breathing tunnels that exhaled from the earth itself. Some even tried to capture them in bottles, convinced they could take the power home. Picture that, grown men in armor, running around on deck with flasks, trying to cork the atmosphere. Historians still debate whether this story is literal or exaggerated, but it perfectly captures how foreign this controlled chaos must have seemed. You lean on the rail, the rain starting to fall like beads on tin. The sea doesn't rage here, it pulses. Every gust feels like a heartbeat. You notice that even when the storm picks up, the crew doesn't panic. They know this wind. They've named it, mapped it, married it. There's something reassuring about watching people coexist so peacefully with something so immense. When the thunder cracks and lightning rips across the sky, You think of how Europeans once feared storms as omens of divine wrath, while the sailors here grin through the deluge like children splashing in puddles. This is Currif, someone shouts over the roar. She's loud, but she loves us. You can't decide if that's poetry or survival psychology, but you understand it completely. By morning, the storm passes. The ship glides through a world washed clean. The sails drip, the air smells of pepper and rain. You spot the helmsman again, holding his face up to the breeze. It's cozy now, he says, almost tenderly. The name rolls off his tongue like a promise. These winds, you realize, are cyclical. They come back, always. And that makes them almost human. Historians still argue whether the monsoon naming traditions spread west through Arab traders or east through Indian pilots, but it doesn't really matter. The truth is, everyone who sailed these waters learned to listen to the same music. You close your eyes and hear it too, the chorus of named winds humming across centuries. The deck glows gold in the returning sun. You feel the humid air press against your skin like a living thing, whispering in languages older than maps. Somewhere far ahead, another ship will catch this same breeze and call it by another name, but the meaning will be the same. Life continues. You smile, thinking maybe the wind doesn't care what humans call it, only that they keep speaking its name. You're back in cooler waters now, though cooler is generous. Everything still smells faintly of sweat, salt, and things that have been damp too long. The ship you're on is larger than before, its decks crowded with the tools of a new kind of sailor. Maps, astrolabes, charts that look more like spiderwebs than navigation aids. It's the late Middle Ages, and Europe has started to rediscover its curiosity. The world is opening up again, and with it, so is the wind's personality. The sailors here don't speak of the gods much. The priests took care of that centuries ago, declaring that naming winds after pagan spirits might accidentally summon them. Still, superstition doesn't die, it just changes its wardrobe. You notice one man tracing a small cross in the air every time the sails creak. Another keeps a sliver of bone tied around his neck, claiming it's from Saint Nicholas, patron of sailors. But when the wind turns suddenly sharp, even the priest on board mutters something that sounds suspiciously like a plea to Boreas. Old habits die harder than barnacles. You glance at the maps again. They're different from the wind roses you saw earlier. More elaborate, more crowded, like someone's nervous doodles took over the world. The margins are filled with faces, each one puffing little streams of air toward the center. These are the 12 winds, each given a name, direction, and temperament. Tramontana, cold and dry, howling down from the Alps. Ostro, damp and southern. Gracal, sharp and cunning, the wind that sneaks in when you're not looking. The artist has drawn them with wild hair and blown cheeks, as if each gust were mid-argument. You realize that medieval mapmakers weren't just charting geography, they were drawing conversations between heaven and earth. You ask the navigator why 12 winds. He shrugs. Because 8 wasn't enough and 16 was too many. Then, after a pause, also, monks like symmetry. You can't tell if he's joking. Historians still argue whether the 12-wind system came from classical revivalism or simple convenience, but the result is mesmerizing. The world, according to these maps, breathes in 12 directions at once. A young apprentice explains how every port had its own way of interpreting those names. In Venice, Libeccio came from Africa. In Marseille, it came from Spain. In Lisbon, it arrived from the Devil's Kitchen, though nobody could quite agree where that was. You try to imagine the chaos of medieval sailors trying to coordinate trade with everyone speaking slightly different wind dialects. It's like inventing your own GPS voice for every town and insisting yours is the only correct one. There's a fact tucked in the logbook you find below deck. Some monks in France once tried to align the 12 winds with the 12 apostles, giving each a saintly patron. Saint Peter for the east wind. One entry reads, Saint John for the mild west. Another note complains that the Judas wind is most treacherous. You close the book, smiling. The medieval mind couldn't resist adding theology to meteorology. You sit near the stone that evening, watching the sunset flare red across the water. The air cools and shifts, the ship rocks differently. Libecchio's waking, says a sailor beside you. He's missing 2 teeth and half a thumb but speaks with reverence, as though addressing an old friend. She likes to stir things up before supper. And sure enough, a low wind begins to roll in from the southwest, playful at first, then insistent. Plates rattle. Lanterns sway. Someone curses. That's her way of saying goodnight. The sailor laughs. There's a fringe belief you overhear later in whispers, that if a wind truly liked you, it would leave a mark on your face while you slept, a faint red streak or a cool patch that lasted until dawn. You check your reflection in the water just in case. Nothing. Maybe you're not the wind's type. As darkness falls, the captain tells a story. Once, he says, a monastery near Genoa built a chapel entirely dedicated to the winds. They carved small windows facing each direction, so that whichever breeze arrived first could enter the nave and pay respects to God. When a storm destroyed it a year later, the monks claimed it was because the winds had argued over who got to pray first. Historians still debate whether the chapel ever existed or if it's a metaphor that got seasick, but you'd like to think it's true. You watch the clouds rolling in, great bruised masses catching the last of the light, and suddenly those 12 names feel less poetic and more practical. Each direction, each name, is a shorthand for survival. Tramontana means reef your sails. Sirocco means tie down everything that moves. You can see why they clung to these labels. They made the invisible navigable. By midnight, the storm has passed, and the deck glistens with rain. The moon glows through the rigging, and you realize something you hadn't before. Naming the wind doesn't just make it personal, it makes it predictable. Once you've said its name, you can talk about it, warn others, tell stories. It turns terror into conversation. You breathe in the damp air. Somewhere below, a sailor is sketching a new version of the wind rose, trying to fit the 12 names into a perfect circle. He hums softly, a tune that mingles with the sighing of the ropes. You think again of that chapel of winds and smile. Maybe all naming is a kind of prayer, an attempt to remind the universe we're listening. The ship rocks gently, like a cradle, and the wind settles into a whisper. You can almost imagine each of the 12 still out there, trading gossip across the night sky, arguing over who gets credit for carrying you safely this far. The ship you find yourself on now feels different, sleeker, more confident, its timbers painted and polished to a shine that dazed the ocean to misbehave. The sailors speak Italian, mostly Neapolitan and Ligurian, and every other word is about the Rose dei Venti, the compass rose. It's no longer a scribble on parchment or a doodle on a monk's desk. It's art, it's religion, it's navigation condensed into color and poetry. You watch as they paint one directly onto the deck, a great circle with radiating lines, each tipped in red or gold, like sunlight trapped under varnish. The captain, sharp-eyed, smells faintly of citrus and authority, kneels beside the painter. Make sure Tramontana points true north, he says, and taps the compass needle with the back of a knife. It trembles, then steadies. A murmur of approval runs through the crew. You realize that this isn't decoration, it's orientation. The ship now has a heart, and it beats in 12 steady directions. The compass rose had started as a humble tool, but by the 13th century, Italian and Catalan mapmakers were turning it into something divine. Each wind had a name, a color, and sometimes even a small painted face. The lines stretched outward like the petals of a flower, hence rose. Every point led to a name whispered by countless sailors before: Greco, Levante, Sirocco, Ostro, Libeccio, Ponente, Maestro, Tramontana. And in between those, subtler breaths, the quarter winds, like the half steps on a scale. Together they made a song of direction, and the ship was its instrument. You stand at the rail as the sea shimmers under the noon sun. The air is warm, but not oppressive. A soft, almost lazy wind nudges the sails from the west. "That's Ponente," says the first mate. "He's a gentleman. Never in a hurry." You nod, as if greeting an old friend. Naming these winds feels strangely intimate, like being introduced to the elements at a dinner party. A mainstream historical fact the captain tells you that evening: the earliest surviving compass roses appear on Portoland charts, those miraculous medieval sea maps from Italy and Spain, drawn with eerie precision centuries before longitude was even understood. Every Portoland began with a central rose, its lines radiating out across the sea like the bones of a giant starfish. These weren't abstract lines, they were literal instructions for life and death. Follow the wrong one, and you might end up shipwrecked, or worse, in France. As the moon rises, you join a small circle of sailors below deck. They are swapping stories about sirocco, the southeast wind. One man swears it makes people go mad, that it drives dogs to howl for no reason. Another insists it carries the scent of desert sand so fine it can make your teeth ache. The priest shakes his head. "Superstition," he says. "Only the Holy Spirit moves the air." But then the candles flicker all at once, and the priest goes silent. You all grin. You find one particular superstition charming. In some Italian ports, sailors painted a tiny compass rose above their doors to keep the right wind near. It wasn't just luck, it was loyalty. People chose their favorite wind the way modern fans choose a sports team. Maestro for the calm-minded, Libeccio for the wild-hearted, Tramontana for those who loved a challenge. Historians still argue whether the choice was based on profession or pure personality, but it's oddly sweet, like humans trying to flirt with the atmosphere. At dawn, you watch the navigator align the ship using a small magnetic compass. He taps the glass twice, checks it against the painted rose, and hums under his breath. There's poetry in that gesture, the living wind meeting the drawn one, the invisible matching the imagined. For a moment, the ship feels perfectly balanced between belief and calculation. The painter from earlier joins you, wiping pigment from his hands. "You know why it's called a rose?" he asks. You start to answer, but he waves you off. "Because when you're lost, it's the only flower that still blooms." He laughs softly at his own joke, but there's truth in it. Every voyage begins in confusion and ends, if you're lucky, with a single direction that feels like home. There's a fringe tidbit the crew loves to repeat after a few drinks: that compass roses weren't just symbols of direction but also of memory. Some sailors claimed each petal represented a loved one or a place left behind. When they looked at the rose mid-storm, they said the lines helped them remember why they sailed at all. Historians still debate whether this sentimental version came later, but the idea makes sense. The sea demands meaning, or you'll drown in randomness. By the time evening rolls around again, Libeccio has taken over. The wind blows strong from the southwest, thick with salt and arrogance. The ship groans, but the crew seems almost pleased. "She's loud, but she gets us home fast," says the captain, shouting above the roar. Rain sprays sideways. The deck tilts. You grip the railing and think, absurdly, that the compass rose must be laughing, its painted petals spinning, its colored lines blurring, alive at last. When the storm subsides, the sea settles into glass. The painted rose gleams under a film of rainwater, each point bright as the night stars above. You find yourself staring at the central dot, the still heart amid all the motion, and understand why this symbol endured. It's not about conquering the wind. It's about coexisting with it, naming it, trusting it to return. You trace one of the lines with your finger and whisper its name. The air answers in kind, a faint, warm exhale that ripples the surface of the sea. The rose glows faintly in the moonlight, and you realize that even after all these centuries, we're still drawing the same symbol, still hoping it leads us somewhere better. You wake to a different rhythm now, the Atlantic. It hums low and wide beneath the ship like a great sleeping animal. The coastline of Portugal is long gone, swallowed by mist, and the sun lifts slow and red across an ocean so vast it seems to have forgotten where land begins. The sails are full, and the crew keeps grinning for no reason. It's the Alicios, someone says, the trade winds. You can almost hear the capital letter when they speak it. These are the winds that make the world move. They blow westward, steady as breath, born off the Sahara and stretching across the Atlantic toward lands no one in Europe had yet mapped in ink. The Portuguese called them ventos alicios, from the word alizé, meaning to smooth. They are the winds that calm the waves and push the caravels toward their destinies, which sounds romantic until you remember those destinies usually involved conquest, gold fever, and the occasional tropical disease. Still, standing there, you understand the sailor's awe. The ship barely needs steering. The sails fill themselves, the ropes creak lazily, and even the captain, usually wound tighter than a drum, leans against the rail with a faint smile. "This is Vendavel's cousin," he mutters. Gentle, but strong enough to carry a nation's greed. You're starting to suspect sailors used family metaphors for winds because they didn't dare call them anything less personal. A mainstream historical fact drifts through your thoughts. By the early 15th century, Portuguese captains had mapped the Atlantic's wind belts so well they could ride them like clockwork. They'd sail down Africa's coast using the Canaries current and the northeast trades, then loop west and north to catch the westerlies home. It wasn't luck, it was a perfectly engineered circle of air, what modern meteorologists still call the volte du mar, the turn of the sea. Without it, exploration would have stayed a nice theory discussed over too much wine. The first mate points toward the horizon. "See that shimmer? That's Levanta dying." You squint. There's nothing obvious, just a slight tremor in the haze, like heat over sand. "He belongs to the Mediterranean," the man continues. "But sometimes he follows us out here, homesick." You can't tell if he's joking, but that's the beauty of sailor talk. It's half meteorology, half poetry. At night, you gather near the stern with the helmsman, who tells a fringe tidbit between chews of hardtack. Apparently, sailors once believed that the Atlantic had moods like a woman. When she was calm, it was Alicio's doing, a faithful lover guiding the ship gently along. But if she turned stormy, it was Vendavel, the jealous southern wind, trying to reclaim her attention. Some captains even kept small charms carved with both names, one on each side, to balance the ship's luck. Historians still argue whether this superstition was born aboard Iberian ships or stolen from older African seafaring lore. But either way, you decide, it's charmingly codependent. The next morning, the ocean has gone glassy. The sails droop, and the air hangs heavy like syrup. The helmsman frowns. The trades have left us. You wait for the captain's order, but he just mutters, "Patience. They'll return." Days pass. The men grow restless. The food sweats in the barrels. Someone tries to whistle for wind, but another sailor slaps his hand away. Apparently, whistling invites storms. You make a mental note that on a ship, even silence has rules. Then one afternoon, the horizon darkens. Not with clouds, but with a faint yellowish tint. "Sirocco dust," says the lookout. Sure enough, a gritty breeze brushes your face, air that has traveled from the Sahara itself, across hundreds of miles of ocean, carrying the scent of heat and dry bones. The captain smiles like an old gambler recognizing his luck. "She's turning," he says. "Our Alicios are waking up again." When the wind returns, it does so with ceremony. The sails fill, the timbers creak, and the ship leaps forward like it's alive. The men cheer, and for a moment, you almost believe the wind is conscious, that it knows when to rescue its faithful. That night, under a sky so clear it looks scrubbed, the captain lets you hold the wheel for a moment. The compass rose glows faintly by lantern light, and you align it with Penenti. The stars above shimmer like punctuation marks on a story that keeps rewriting itself. The sea hisses softly, a steady exhale. "You see," the captain says, "it's not we who move, it's the wind that lends us motion." You notice then how many wind names are Portuguese: Norte, Sol, Leste, Oeste, Levante, Poente, Vendaval, Alicio. They sound like poetry carved from salt. It's easy to forget that each word is the result of generations who measured life by gusts and currents, who learned to map time through air. The Atlantic was their classroom, their cathedral, and occasionally their grave. A sudden laugh breaks your reverie. One of the younger sailors has tied a scrap of fabric to the railing, a tiny pennant that flutters like it's alive. "For good fortune," he says. You realize the piece of cloth is painted with a small letter A for Alicio, he explains. "He's our patron today." You smile. The idea of dedicating part of the ship to a single wind feels absurdly human, naming the infinite so it feels like company. Historians still argue whether naming winds was ever meant literally or just culturally. Were they praying, or were they labeling? The answer doesn't really matter, you think, because when the wind hits your face, warm and sure, it's impossible not to talk to it like an old friend. As the voyage continues, the Portuguese winds weave their own legend. Vendaval, fierce from the southwest, becomes the villain of most sea tales. Levante the wanderer, Alicio the faithful guide, Tramontana the icy judge. You realize these aren't mere directions, they are personalities, moods of a living ocean. By dawn, you've stopped trying to separate the myths from the meteorology. You just breathe in the salt air and whisper their names one by one, as if greeting a row of familiar ghosts. The ship keeps slicing forward, the wind humming its endless tune. Somewhere far behind, the land you came from fades into rumor, but ahead, oh, ahead, the horizon is full of possibility, all of it spelled in the secret language of the wind. You can tell the difference the moment it happens. This isn't a mere gust, or one of Alicio's friendly pushes. The air thickens Faust, heavy and warm, like someone holding their breath. Then the horizon bruises purple, and the sea begins to pace restlessly beneath the hull. The crew stops joking. A few cross themselves. A few pretend not to. You hear the bosun murmur something under his breath. 3 syllables, quick and secret. A name. Because now comes the other side of wind naming, the side born not from admiration, but fear. When a storm grows teeth, a sailor gives it a name so he can argue with it, bargain with it, plead. Tonight, the men call it Santa Clara's breath. Tomorrow it might be Old Joan, or the Widowmaker, or something less printable. Names make chaos smaller. That's the theory, anyway. You help lash the barrels, your hands slippery with salt and sweat. The captain paces like a man wrestling with invisible ropes. "This'll come from the southwest," he says, squinting into the dark. That's Vendaval, and he's in no mood for mercy. The wind answers with a low groan, as if it heard its own name. A flash of lightning blinds you. Then the rain starts, big, angry drops that sting your face and soak your clothes in seconds. The sails crack like gunshots. Someone yells that the mainmast's straining. Someone else laughs, hysterically. fear at sea has its own sense of humor. A mainstream historical fact: during the age of exploration, sailors truly did name storms, not systematically, like modern meteorologists, but personally, almost familiarly. Logs from the 16th and 17th centuries mention the Great White Wind, the Devil's Lantern, and San Roque's Fury. Early Portuguese records even list a storm called Maria das Sete Vozes, Mary of the Seven Voices, because its howling changed pitch 7 times before tearing a ship apart near Madeira. It's a grim kind of poetry, but it kept the unknown from feeling infinite. Lightning forks again. You smell ozone, sharp, metallic. She's splitting the sky, the first mate shouts. The sea will answer. And it does. Waves ray up like cathedral walls, collapsing in silver avalanches. The wind shrieks, furious that anything dares stand on its water. The ship lurches. Somewhere, something cracks. The captain roars over the chaos. Call her by her name, lads. Santa Clara, have mercy. The men join in, shouting the same plea over and over, their voices breaking. It's absurd, yelling at the weather. But you feel it too, the urge to humanize the violence. If the wind can be angry, maybe it can forgive. Below deck, between crashes, the carpenter tells you a fringe tidbit. Some sailors used to carry vials of holy oil to anoint the sea. They'd pour it overboard during storms, believing it calmed the waves. Modern science later confirmed oil can smooth the surface tension of water, but only a thin patch. Still, for those sailors, it wasn't chemistry. It was conversation. Hush now, old one, they'd whisper. We've named you fair. Let us pass. The storm howls on. Someone mutters that whistling brought it. Someone must have ignored the rule. You half laugh, half believe. At sea, logic and superstition dance so close they might as well be lovers. Hours later, the wind begins to tire. It always does. The rain slackens, the lightning wanders away like a bored god, and the sea exhales, rolling but no longer raging. The ship, battered but breathing, creaks in relief. The men slump wherever they can sit, soaked and trembling. One sailor, young and pale, lifts his head. She's gone, he whispers. Then, almost tenderly, goodbye, Clara. When dawn creeps in, the ocean looks as though nothing happened. The sky blushes pink, innocent as a child. You help swab the deck, but your mind drifts. You wonder, if you name the wind after a saint, does that make the sea holier? Or if you name it after death, does it spare you from finding out? Historians still argue whether the tradition of naming storms was more religious or psychological, but you think maybe it was both. People name what they fear most, because it's the only way to survive sharing space with it. As the crew repairs torn rigging, someone carves the name Santa Clara into a plank near the stern. She'll protect us now, says the carpenter. You raise an eyebrow. Didn't she just try to kill us? He grins. Exactly. Who better to keep the next one away? Later, as the sun climbs higher, the wind returns, gentle this time, like an apology. You lean on the rail, watching it ripple across the sails. Every hiss, every creak, every sigh feels alive. You can almost hear whispers in the air. You called me, you survived me, remember me. You do. You always will. Naming a storm makes it unforgettable. That's the deal. And somewhere deep inside, you realize that each name given out here, each whispered plea and curse, feeds the same strange hope, that the wind, vast and indifferent, might be listening after all. You're still at sea, but something in the rhythm has changed. The ropes creak differently, the gulls sound unfamiliar, and the waves carry a new kind of pulse. The age of exploration has entered its golden, some would say dangerous, phase. Around you, the sailors wear confidence like armor. They've named every wind, mapped every route, and convinced themselves they've tamed the elements. You, of course, know better. The morning sun shines harshly on the deck, making every salt crystal sparkle like mock applause. The navigator's cabin smells of ink and rum, and you peek inside to see him bent over a chart, drawing neat red lines that slice across the Atlantic like knife wounds. Each line follows a wind's spine: Alizé, Vendaval, Lest, Ponente. He mutters to himself as he works, and every now and then you hear him whisper a wind's name under his breath, as if asking permission. It's easy to forget, watching this organized chaos, that every discovery these men claim begins and ends with the whims of air. A gust too strong, and you're blown off course toward despair. A calm too long, and your ship rots in place while men start counting crumbs and sanity slips overboard. A mainstream historical fact slips in on that thought. Nearly every major voyage of discovery, from Columbus in 1492 to Magellan's circumnavigation, succeeded or failed based entirely on understanding wind belts. The trade winds and westerlies were invisible highways, dictating empire more than any monarch ever could. The sailors may have named the winds, but in truth, the winds were naming history. One afternoon, Alizé is strong and kind, guiding you westward with a confidence that feels divine. Spirits are high. The cook even sings. But by nightfall, the air shifts, subtle, then sudden. The sails flap like startled birds, and the stars vanish behind thick, bruised clouds. "She's turning," mutters the captain. "We're crossing into Vendaval's court again." You glance at the compass rose. Its painted petals gleam dully in the lamplight, as if it too is nervous. This time, the storm doesn't roar. It lurks. The ship slides into a slow, deceptive swell, the kind that looks harmless until it isn't. The men whisper that this is the sort of weather that tests your promises. You're not sure what that means, but it sounds like the kind of wisdom that comes from surviving too much. A young sailor tells you a fringe tidbit. Some ships used to carry caged birds, small sparrows or even swallows, not as pets, but as wind tellers. If the air grew strange, the birds would grow frantic before the storm arrived. The sailor grins. They know before we do. He opens a tiny cage near the mast. The bird inside shifts restlessly, feathers puffed. "Bad omen," he says quietly. "Or good?" Historians still argue which. By midnight, the sky unravels completely. Lightning sketches quick ghosts across the horizon, and thunder rolls like an old god's laugh. You brace yourself against the rail, drenched and dazzled, and think about the absurd symmetry of it all, how the same winds that carried explorers to glory also dragged them toward ruin. Discovery and disaster are siblings out here, born of the same breath. The ship plunges, groans, then rights itself again. You hear the helmsman cursing under his breath, not at the sea but at the wind itself. "Pick a direction, you fickle devil," he yells, and the gale answers by slapping the sails sideways. A barrel breaks loose and rolls across the deck. Someone laughs, because at some point, laughter is all that's left between chaos and prayer. When dawn comes, the storm dies almost politely. The sky clears in embarrassed patches, like a fight cooling off. The ship limps onward, her sails shredded but intact. You and the crew sit in stunned silence, staring at the horizon. The captain breaks it first. "We've met our maker," he says, "and he's got terrible manners." The men chuckle weakly. But later, as the sun climbs higher, you notice something strange. The air feels different. Softer. Wiser, almost. You realize the storm didn't just threaten to kill you, it taught you. Each wind, named or not, seems to carry memory. Alizé's warmth feels heavier now, touched by Vendaval's temper. The world's edges blur, and you start to see why sailors treat winds like old acquaintances, moody, unpredictable, but always coming back. Over a meager breakfast of ship's biscuit, the first mate says, "You ever think the winds know what they are doing?" You shrug. He grins. "They always seem to blow us somewhere worth a story, don't they?" You can't argue with that. Even disaster, retold, becomes discovery. Historians still debate how much of early exploration was planned genius and how much was blind luck aided by weather. Some argue Columbus discovered nothing, he simply rode the right wind at the right time. Others insist it took courage to trust those gusts enough to leave sight of land. You decide the truth probably lies somewhere between courage and coincidence. As the ship sails on, you find a kind of peace in the uncertainty. The horizon stretches endless, the air hums steady, and you whisper the wind names like prayers: Alizé, Ponente, Libeccio, Tramontana. The words taste old and patient. You can almost believe that, somewhere far beyond sight, the winds whisper your name back. You've learned by now that every gust has a twin, a calm waiting to follow it. Every discovery comes with a cost. And every wind, no matter how violent or kind, leaves its fingerprint on you. That's the secret the explorers never wrote down. You don't just name the wind. The wind names you. By now, you've learned that a ship isn't just a machine. It's a stage for 1,000 small rituals, all designed to keep the wind happy. Or at least, that's what the sailors believe. The sea may be physics, but life on deck is pure superstition. You can feel it in the way the crew moves, each gesture deliberate, half habit, half prayer. Today, the wind is playful, flicking the sails like a teasing friend. You lean on the rail beside an old quartermaster who's polishing a brass compass with the devotion of a monk. "Don't whistle," he says without looking up. You laugh, thinking he's joking, but his eyes flick toward you, sharp, warning. "You'll call the gale," he says. "The wind loves to mimic." You tuck your lips shut. The air smells of tar, salt, and a hint of oranges from the cargo hold. Someone's humming low under their breath, a rhythm that almost matches the creak of the ropes. It feels soothing, until you notice that every time the melody rises, another sailor shushes him. "No music before sunset," someone mutters. "The ladies of the wind don't like competition." You nod sagely, pretending to understand, though you're dying to ask who exactly these ladies are. The answer comes later that evening, when the light fades and the crew gathers at the stern. The captain doesn't join them, he's too proud for myth, but the others stand in quiet formation, facing the west. The horizon burns orange, and for a moment, the sea looks like molten glass. One sailor raises a small cup of rum, spills a few drops into the water, and murmurs, "For the lady who brought us this far." The others repeat it softly, a dozen voices loud over the whisper of the waves. A mainstream historical fact glides through your mind. During the age of exploration, sailors across Europe often referred to the winds as feminine spirits, protective yet temperamental. The Greeks had Ori, the Romans had Venti, and later mariners simply called them she. Ships, too, were always she. Naming both the vessel and the wind as women wasn't random. It was reverence, fear, and flattery rolled into one. But then the quartermaster leans close, voice low. "There's one you don't want to name," he says. "The silent one. The wind that steals breath instead of giving it." He spits into the sea for luck. You don't ask for details. As the stars appear, another sailor tells you a fringe tidbit. Some ships carried a wind bag, a small leather pouch tied to the mast. Inside it were knotted strings, said to contain captured breezes. The helmsman would untie one during calm days to release a gentle gust. The story supposedly came from Norse tradition, where Aelus, or Aegir, sold favorable winds to desperate captains. Historians still argue whether it ever actually happened, but they all agree sailors believed it could. And belief, at sea, might be the strongest force there is. You start noticing other rituals. The youngest sailor always touches the mainmast before dawn. The cook tosses a pinch of salt over his shoulder before serving stew. The navigator draws a tiny sun in chalk each morning beside the compass rose, erasing it at dusk. Keeps the horizon awake, he explains with a shrug. Every act seems ridiculous until you realize what they're really doing, making peace with uncertainty. That night, the wind shifts again, stronger now. The sails swell, ropes groan, and the ship accelerates, slicing the black water cleanly. A voice carries from the crow's nest, "She's favoring us tonight." The men grin, half in awe, half in relief. You look up at the mast and swear the canvas itself seems alive, breathing, sighing, flirting with the air. But the quartermaster's face stays serious. "Never boast," he warns. "The ladies hear pride clearer than prayer." You stifle your grin. At sea, even laughter can offend the divine. As midnight falls, the sky clears to silver. You stand by the helm, watching the compass needle tremble faintly, twitching toward Penenti. You whisper the name softly, just once, and the helmsman gives you a look that's both knowing and tired. "Careful," he says. You start naming them yourself, and they'll start noticing you. There's something beautifully eerie about that idea. The notion that winds might listen, might keep score. Maybe that's why sailors always personified them, so they wouldn't feel unseen. It's hard enough to fight the sea without also believing the sky is indifferent. Historians still argue whether these shipboard superstitions were inherited from pagan Europe, borrowed from Islamic sailors, or simply invented anew in the loneliness of the Atlantic. But one thing they agree on: they worked. Not because they changed the weather, but because they changed the men. Naming fears gives them edges. Ritual gives chaos rhythm. And rhythm keeps you sane when the world is water in every direction. As the night deepens, you catch the faintest whisper in the rigging, soft, almost kind. The sails ripple once, then still. The stars lean low, close enough to hear your breath. You think you might have imagined it, but you could swear the air just said your name. You smile. Maybe superstition isn't madness. Maybe it's just the wind saying hello. The next morning dawns calm, eerily calm. The sea stretches like a pane of bluish glass, unbroken except for the slow drift of floating kelp. The sails hang loose, limp as laundry, and the ship barely sways. There's a stillness that feels wrong, an absence so total it hums. The crew moves quietly, as if sound itself might break the spell. Someone mutters the word doldrums. You hear it again and again, whispered like a diagnosis. You've read the word in books before. It's a region near the equator where hot air rises straight up, leaving ships stranded for days or even weeks. But hearing it spoken here, under this suffocating sky, gives it a different kind of weight. It isn't just weather. It's a mood. The doldrums are the place where the wind forgets your name. A mainstream historical fact drifts through your memory. In the 17th and 18th centuries, sailors dreaded this region so much that the doldrums eventually became a metaphor for depression, boredom, hopelessness. You can feel why. The sun burns high, unblinking. The ocean gleams like metal. There's no sound but the creak of timbers shrinking in the heat. By noon, the deck feels like an oven. Men stripped to the waist, moving slow, conserving energy. The cook refuses to light his stove. The captain paces the quarterdeck, eyes flicking between compass and horizon as if one might move first. The quartermaster, always calm, ties a strip of red cloth to the rigging, a superstition meant to lure the breeze. Below deck, it's worse. The air tastes like copper and sweat. The smell of stagnant water mixes with tar and mildew. You climb back up just to breathe. Every sailor you pass looks half crazed by the stillness, muttering old charms under their breath. Then, without warning, you hear a shout from the bow, "Wind off starboard." Everyone freezes, then rushes to the rail. But when you reach it, there's nothing. Just a faint shimmer on the horizon, a trick of heat, maybe. The lookout insists he felt it, though, a soft kiss of air, like a sigh against the cheek. That's enough to raise spirits. Hope is a current of its own. The quartermaster chuckles darkly. Could be one of the horse latitudes, he says. You ask what that means, and his answer makes you wish you hadn't. He tells you a fringe but recorded tidbit. Centuries ago, when ships carrying horses from Spain to the Americas were becalmed for too long, food and water ran short. The desperate crew would throw the horses overboard to save themselves. The name stuck, Horse Latitudes, a grim memorial to the beasts that sank silently beneath windless skies. Whether or not every tale is true, the name endures, etched into maps like a warning. You picture it, the dark shapes of animals thrashing, the silence after. You start to understand how every piece of sailor's language is soaked in blood, prayer, or loss. Words like trade winds sound simple until you realize they're the veins of empire. Phrases like Roaring Forties and Furious 50s aren't poetry, they're survival maps. Around sunset, a faint ripple moves across the water. You see it before you feel it, a shimmer of motion, like the ocean exhaling. The sails stir. Canvas flutters. The helmsman grins and calls out, "She's back." It's just a whisper at first, barely enough to push the ship. But the crew cheers as if they've seen a miracle. Maybe they have. The flag flutters, ropes creak, and the compass needle trembles back to life. You can smell salt again, sharp and alive. A sailor near you, barefoot, sunburned, half delirious, laughs and kisses his palm before touching the wind. "Good girl," he says. "We missed you." You laugh too, though there's something eerie about his tone. You realize how quickly gratitude replaces reason out here. How easy it is to love what almost killed you. As darkness falls, the breeze steadies. The stars return, glinting like pins in velvet. The ship glides forward, and the men sing quietly, a shanty about trading winds and lovers lost in Lisbon. The rhythm is hypnotic, like the roll of the hull. You catch fragments of the lyrics. North she blows and south she cries, westward where the daylight dies. You wonder who first sang it. Probably someone long dead, whose bones rest on the ocean floor somewhere near the equator. Maybe that's the secret purpose of naming winds, to keep those voices alive, to give memory a direction. Below deck, you write in your journal by the light of a flickering lantern. You try to list all the wind names you've learned so far: Boreas, Zephyrus, Vendaval, Sirocco, Mistral, Cascazi, and realize each one feels like a personality, not a phenomenon. You draw a little wind rose in the margin, just as medieval cartographers once did. The candle gutters once, then steadies. You pause, noticing the faint draft moving through the cabin. It brushes your cheek, cool and deliberate, almost affectionate. You whisper, "Thank you." No one answers, but the flame bends slightly, like a nod. Maybe you're imagining it. Maybe not. At sea, it's hard to tell where the science ends and the story begins. But as you fall asleep, you can't shake the feeling that somewhere above deck, the wind is listening again, curious to hear what you'll name her next. By dawn, the ship is moving steady again, slow but sure. The ocean has texture once more, ripples, sighs, a rhythm. You stand by the railing, watching the sunlight peel itself over the horizon, a slow shimmer of gold across the water. The air is warm and kind, brushing against your neck like a lazy cat. You realize how quickly sailors forgive the wind. Yesterday it was the villain, Today it's the hero. You can almost hear the unspoken rule: never stay angry at what keeps you alive. The navigator, a wiry man with ink-stained fingers, spreads his sea chart across a barrel. It's covered with circles and lines radiating outward like a flower, what sailors call a wind rose. Each petal bears a name: Tramontana, Greco, Levante, Sirocco, Ostro, Libeccio, Ponente, mistral. 8 directions. 8 tempers. He traces them with his finger and tells you a mainstream historical fact. This design dates back to the medieval compass rose used by Italian and Arab sailors in the Mediterranean. The names often match the direction of famous winds, not the cardinal points of north, south, east, and west. In other words, people oriented themselves by personalities, not geometry. You didn't sail north, you sailed into the Tramontana's domain. The idea charms you. It feels more human somehow, less mathematical, more musical. You wonder what kind of people would rather map the world by moods than measurements. Probably the same ones who believed a ship's figurehead could protect them from sea spirits. The navigator chuckles when he sees your curiosity. Every name's a story, he says, tapping the parchment. Sirocco means it blows from Syria. Libeccio comes from Libya. Mistral, the master wind, because it ruled over the rest. Every culture has their own set. We're just one chorus in a very loud choir. He's right. As the voyage continues, you start hearing fragments of wind lore from every man aboard. A sailor from the Baltic swears that when the bise blows, it brings bad luck unless you spit to leeward Faust. A Greek deckhand mutters that Zephyros, the west wind, once fell in love with a mortal boy and still chases him across the sea. The cabin boy insists that whistling invites storms, and the bosun smacks him on the head for testing the theory. Sailors' superstitions seem endless. You've learned not to laugh. Once, you saw a man toss a handful of salt into the breeze before hauling a line, whispering something under his breath. You asked why. He said, to feed the wind before it feeds on us. You didn't ask again. By midday, the heat sharpens, and the sea glitters like 1,000 knives. The air hums with that electric shimmer again, and someone mentions the trades. It sounds simple enough. Trade winds, the reliable east-to-west currents that carried explorers, merchants, and colonizers alike. But the word trade doesn't just mean commerce. It comes from the Old English tradan, meaning path or track. These winds were the grooves of the world. Some captains swore the trade winds had personalities depending on the cargo. Carrying spices? They'd be sweet and steady. Slaves? They'd turn violent, as if ashamed of what they carried. Whether that's coincidence or conscience, no one knows. But historians still argue whether such stories were moral metaphors or genuine sailors' lore. Maybe both. The sea tends to blend truth and guilt until they look the same color. The ship glides faster now, the sails puffed like lungs full of pride. The captain looks younger, his voice louder, as he shouts orders down the deck. The wind hums through the rigging like a cathedral organ. You can feel it. This is what they live for. Not the destination, not the glory, but this communion with the unseen. You lean into the gust, letting it lift your hair, your pulse syncing with the rhythm of the sea. You realize how much of navigation was faith disguised as science. Even after compasses, sextants, and star maps, the sailors still needed trust. Trust that the invisible hand pushing them west would not suddenly vanish. As the day fades, the horizon stains itself orange and purple. You notice the men growing quiet, contemplative, as they watch the sun melt into the sea. The wind softens too, as if sighing itself to sleep. A lantern swings gently from the mast, glowing like a trapped firefly. You find the navigator again and ask him what happens when they reach land. Do the winds still have names then? He smiles, eyes reflecting flame. Of course. They follow us ashore. They slip into the valleys, rattle shutters, hum through olive trees. The same winds that carried us here will kiss your face on the coast. Only difference is, the land folk forget their names. Something about that sticks with you. You think of all the storms and calms, all the whispers and roars you've passed through, and realize how strange it will be to stand on unmoving ground again. How silent it might feel. Before turning in, you look back once more at the ocean. The breeze curls around you, playful, almost affectionate. You can't help but whisper a word you've learned along the way, Zephyr. It means gentle wind. But in that moment, it feels like something closer to home. The sea is glass again, but this time it's different. The calm isn't oppressive, it's contemplative. You've sailed long enough now to recognize that silence on the ocean isn't always a threat. Sometimes, it's the world catching its breath. The men work quietly, voices low, as if speaking too loud might offend the air itself. You sit by the railing, watching the ship carve a perfect mirror of itself on the water's surface. The reflection looks like another world, upside down, ghostly, but strangely steady. You start to imagine that maybe the wind has two faces too, one above, one below, and that they trade secrets through the ripples. Below deck, a few sailors huddle around a lantern, telling stories to pass the time. You join them, the air thick with the smell of tar and dried fruit. One of them, an older man with a missing thumb, begins a tale that hushes the group. He swears that in the 1500s, Spanish galleons sailing to the New World sometimes carried wind boxes, small wooden chests sealed with wax and rope. Inside, he says, was captured air, bottled by witches along the coasts of Galicia. Each box held 3 knots of twine. 1 knot for a breeze, 2 for a gust, 3 for a gale. When the voyage stalled, the captain would untie a knot, and the wind would answer. You laugh softly, assuming it's a joke. But he shakes his head. Don't mock it, he says. Even the Admiralty kept one in London. Just in case. It sounds absurd, but you remember reading a mainstream historical fact about this kind of superstition. Sailors really did buy winds in a bag from northern witches, especially in Iceland and the Faroe Islands, well into the 17th century. Most historians think it was symbolic, a charm against fear. But some ships swore the boxes worked. Historians still argue whether these tales were literal or metaphorical, but you've seen enough out here to know how little separates belief from survival. The next morning, the ship passes a line of faint clouds, thin as gauze, streaking the horizon. The helmsman calls it a mare's tail, a cirrus formation that sailors took as a sign of wind returning. Mare's tails and mackerel skies, he mutters, make tall ships carry low ties. It's an old rhyme, a warning that rough weather may be near. The phrase lingers in your mind, the way sailor lore always does, half prophecy, half poetry. Even the clouds have their dialect. As the day stretches on, the air thickens with the scent of rain, and you feel a prickling on your skin. The wind begins to gather again, not fierce, but purposeful. The sails fill, the ship leans slightly to port. A new rhythm begins, familiar and comforting. The ocean finds its voice. The captain emerges, coat flapping, beard whipped into white spray. The monsoon's path, he says, nodding toward the east. You blink. That word you know, monsoon, but it sounds strange here, halfway between legend and geography. He explains that monsoons are not single winds but entire systems, reversing direction with the seasons. Traders once built empires on them, Arab, Indian, Chinese, long before Europe found its sea legs. The word itself comes from the Arabic mausim, meaning season. You picture centuries of dhows and junks gliding across the Indian Ocean, perfectly in sync with the world's breath. Then he adds, Some called it the wind's calendar. You smile at that, how poetic and practical at once. You think about all the ways people have learned to live with the wind instead of against it. The monsoon, the trades, the roaring forties, each a pulse in Earth's great lung. Later that night, as rain begins to fall, the ship's carpenter tells you another fringe tidbit, that sailors once believed the wind had colors. They said Boreas was blue-white and cold as steel, Zephyrus golden and sweet, Notus a bruised red, and Eurus a sharp green. Some claimed you could see the difference on the sails, tiny glows, like ghosts brushing the canvas. Of course, no one's ever proven that, but you find yourself watching the rigging, half hoping for it. The rain thickens. The world becomes sound, drumming, hissing, roaring. The ship rolls, timbers groaning, but it feels alive, pulsing. The wind doesn't howl so much as speak now, words too old to translate. You stand near the helm, soaked and shivering, watching the captain grin into the storm like an old friend's face has returned. For the first time, you sense it too, the presence, the intimacy. This isn't domination or prayer anymore. It's partnership. The sailors shout, the ship answers, the wind obliges. Everything working, breathing, existing together. You can almost hear the logic behind centuries of naming. To name something is to acknowledge its agency, its mood, its right to exist beside you rather than beneath you. The storm passes quickly, as all tempests do once they've said their piece. The sky opens in shreds of pink and gold, and the sea calms to a hum. You find yourself laughing softly. Not because anything is funny, but because the silence after feels like applause. Somewhere deep in the ship's timbers, the last gust whistles away, a sound like a sigh, a farewell. You whisper thank you, and mean it. As night drapes itself over the water, you notice something strange. The stars look closer than before, as if the wind has pushed you into their orbit. For the first time since you began this journey, you feel that the world's vastness is not an enemy but an invitation. The invisible, finally, is not to be feared, but understood. The next morning feels like waking up inside a painting, everything slow, bright, and still dripping with the storm's aftermath. The deck glistens, the ropes steam faintly, and the air hums with that freshly washed clarity sailors call the morning breath of God. You stretch your arms and feel it, the light, teasing push of a new wind. Gentle but sure, as if the world has pressed the restart button. By now, the crew trusts you enough to treat you like one of their own. You haul lines, scrub decks, eat the same hard biscuits that taste like fossilized clouds. Every task has rhythm, every rhythm has its breath. You start noticing how often wind dictates even the smallest gestures. When to speak, when to pause, when to laugh. Out here, every conversation has a direction. The bosun, always poetic when half awake, leans beside you and murmurs, "This one's a cat's paw morning." You look down at the sea and see what he means. Faint, flickering ripples racing across the surface, shaped like invisible paws. Sailors believe these marks are the wind's fingerprints, a sign of its playful return. He grins. The cat's out hunting again. That's the thing about them. These men talk about the wind the way city folk talk about the weather, lovers, or debts. Each has his favorite kind. Some adore the warm, fragrant breezes off the coast of Africa. Others swear by the cutting, icy gusts from the north that make the ship feel honest. And a few, those slightly unhinged ones, miss the storms when they are gone. Too much peace, one mutters, makes a man forget he's alive. As you coil rope with blistered hands, the quartermaster passes by humming a shanty. You catch a verse. South wind, my sister, tell me your name. East wind, my lover, you're never the same. North wind, my father, stern and old. West wind, my brother, wild and bold. The melody is haunting, half dirge, half lullaby. He tells you it's older than maps, passed from Phoenician traders to Viking crews to Portuguese explorers. Nobody owns it, but everyone claims it. You smile. The wind doesn't belong to anyone, yet it touches everyone. Maybe that's the oldest democracy of all. A mainstream historical fact drifts up as you listen. By the 17th century, European navigators had fully integrated the classical Greek wind system, Boreas, Notus, Eurus, Zephyrus, into practical compass directions. They merged mythology and math. North became Boreas, east Eurus, and so on. Wind gods turned into data points. You can't decide if that's progress or poetry. Still, the old myths never fully died. Somewhere near the Azores, a sailor tells you that if you whistle softly into the night, Zephyrus will answer with a breeze, but only if your heart is calm. You test it once, late that evening, standing alone at the rail. The air is still for a moment, then stirs faintly against your cheek. You laugh quietly. Coincidence? Maybe. But you choose to believe you've just been serenaded by an immortal float. That's when you realize belief itself is the wind's twin, unseen, unprovable, but felt everywhere. Later, in the captain's cabin, you study a map older than the ship itself. Its parchment is yellowed, corners cracked, names written in Latin and Italian. Around the edges are strange faces, cheeky cherubs with puffed cheeks, blowing gusts across the world. You recognize them instantly. They are the venti, the personified winds of Renaissance cartography. Every breath of the world, sketched as a chubby divine prankster. The captain sees you staring. They kept those faces long after we had compasses, he says. Maybe we just liked pretending the world still needed us to ask permission. That hits you harder than you expect. The longer you've been at sea, the more you understand the blend of arrogance and humility that defines sailors. You can't command the wind, but you can name it, map it, sing it, and beg it to love you. That balance, that constant dance between mastery and surrender, feels almost human. As dusk falls, the ship crosses invisible borders of climate. The air thickens again, smelling faintly of cinnamon and rain. The navigator checks his instruments and says, "We're slipping into the Roaring Forties." The words sound like an invitation and a threat. You've heard of them, the furious winds that circle the globe between 40 and 50 degrees south, unbroken by land. The realm of endless waves and howling gales. Here, sailors didn't name individual winds anymore, they named entire tempers. "Hold on tight," someone mutters, tightening a knot. The first gusts come without warning, low, moaning, steady. The ship groans, sails strain, ropes hum. You feel it deep in your bones, the pulse of the planet itself. The captain shouts commands, voices disappear in the noise. The world becomes motion and thunder. Then the rain hits, slanting, stinging, silver knives. You can barely see, but you don't care. Every nerve feels awake. Somewhere in the chaos, the bosun is laughing, wild and unhinged, shouting at the storm by name. "Come on then, roarer. Show us your teeth." A lightning flash splits the sky, carving every face into a brief sculpture of awe. For a moment, you think you see shapes in the wind itself, walls of mist twisting into something almost human, then vanishing. Maybe imagination, maybe exhaustion. But something deep inside you whispers, they are listening. The storm lasts all night, the ship riding it like a stubborn horse. Every creak, every slap of wave against hull feels like a heartbeat. You hold tight to the rigging and realize something you can't unthink. The sailors of old didn't just name the wind to control it, they named it to join it. And as dawn begins to crack the sky open in streaks of gray and silver, you laugh through the rain, salt on your lips, whispering to no one and everyone, "I finally get it." Morning breaks slow, heavy, and holy. The storm is gone, leaving the world rinsed and trembling. The ship glides over bruised blue water, its sails full but gentle now, like lungs finally exhaling after holding breath too long. You stand barefoot on the deck, the boards still slick, the air soft against your skin. Every sound feels amplified, the sigh of the rigging, the groan of the mast, the rhythmic splash beneath the hull. No one speaks for a long time. Even the captain, usually all bark and thunder, just watches the horizon with the quiet reverence of someone who's survived another sermon from nature. You think back over every wind you've met on this voyage, the whispering zephyr, the sulking boreas, the jealous sirocco, the roaring forties. They've all left fingerprints on you, salt crusting your eyelashes, stories carved into your ribs. The bosun finally breaks the silence. You notice, he says, after every gale, the wind comes back different, like it's remembered our names. You nod. The thought feels right. Maybe naming the wind wasn't humanity trying to tame it. It was the wind teaching humanity to listen. Below deck, the crew begins to stir. Some pray, some eat, some just stare at the walls like men reintroduced to stillness. You can feel their exhaustion, but also a quiet pride. They've ridden through something vast and survived, again. And that's the strange contract of seafaring. The wind tries to kill you just often enough to remind you you're alive. You step back onto the deck as the first sunlight hits the sails. The canvas glows, thin, golden, trembling slightly with the breath of the new day. The air smells of wet hemp, citrus peel, and the faint sweetness of pitch. You could live in that smell forever. The navigator joins you, wiping sleep from his eyes. He unrolls a chart, the paper damp and warped. It's full of markings, loops, lines, ink stains that look almost like veins. We've been naming things wrong, he says quietly. We name winds like they're separate, but really it's all one breath, circling the world, never stopping. It's such a simple thought, yet it lands deep. The winds of every hemisphere, every ship, every era, it's all the same voice, speaking in dialects of temperature and salt. What one sailor called boreas, another called kaskazi, another nor'easter. The names were never about ownership. They were thank yous, apologies, love letters to the invisible. You remember a mainstream historical fact. When the first global wind maps were drawn in the 19th century, scientists discovered that all those local winds, trade, monsoon, mistral, sirocco, were parts of the same planetary circulation. The ancients weren't wrong, just poetic. They'd already known the unity through myth long before science confirmed it. Historians still argue whether those names preserved genuine weather wisdom or were simply cultural decoration. But you realize now it doesn't matter. They were right in spirit. The quartermaster brings up coffee boiled black and strong enough to peel paint. He sets down a cup beside you, muttering, "To the lady who never keeps her mood." You clink your tin mug against his and smile. When the wind shifts again, a gentle cross-current, you can almost sense a personality in it. A kind of recognition. Maybe that's superstition. Maybe it's truth. Out here, the two are twins. By afternoon, the coastline appears, a faint smudge on the edge of the world. The crew cheers. Land always looks impossible after so much nothing. As the ship approaches, you watch palm fronds ripple on distant hills, already swaying to the same wind that carried you across oceans. The realization hits quietly but hard, there is no other side. The same breath that filled your sails now touches the leaves ashore, moves through valleys, whispers through cities. And so you begin to understand what the sailors of the age of exploration truly did when they named the wind. They weren't mapping conquest or direction. They were writing the first human dictionary of all. When the anchor finally drops, the world grows still again. You close your eyes, the last traces of salt drying on your skin, and listen. There's a faint rustle through the palms on shore, a familiar rhythm. You smile. You know its name now, but you also know it doesn't need one. You whisper anyway, out of habit and gratitude. Thank you, Zephyr. Or Boris. Or whoever you're being today. The air stirs once, briefly, brushing your cheek like a goodbye kiss. And then it's gone. The world grows soft around you now. The sea's heartbeat fades to a murmur, the ship's creaks to a sigh. You breathe slow, steady, the same rhythm as the waves. Every gust you've met still lingers in your lungs, 1,000 invisible companions swirling quiet behind your eyelids. You picture them now, the mistral threading through lavender fields in Provence, the monsoon carrying rain to the Indian coast, the trade winds crossing deserts of invisible salt. All of them moving, always moving, looping through time and tide. Every breath you take tonight is borrowed from some sailor's story, some ancient storm, some whispered prayer. It's strange, isn't it, how the simplest things, the air, the motion, the nameless push of existence, turn out to be the most eternal. Maybe the sailors had it right all along. You name the wind not to possess it, but to remember it. To remind yourself that you're small, and that smallness is holy. The waves hush further. The sky darkens to indigo, the stars drifting like forgotten lanterns. You exhale once, slow, feeling everything ease. Your body, your thoughts, your need to move. The wind has a way of finding you, even here, even now. It presses softly at the window, gentle, curious, still telling stories to those who listen. So breathe in one more time. Let it fill you, that ancient, wandering air, the same one that touched explorers, poets, and dreamers long before you. The same one that will still be here when all maps fade. Rest easy. The wind knows your name now too.